Hey everyone, Reaper here again with another video game video. I've been waiting to do this video for a while. I wanted to make a couple other videos before I got to this, but now I'm fully psyched to make it. It is my Resident Evil video game video. It's really appreciation and just a little bit of a discussion about Resident Evil and the series, what it meant to me, and some of the Resident Evil games in my collection. So forgive me if I'm going to be a little all over the place. This is the one video that I don't have any notes. I'm just going with it, okay? So let's begin. Resident Evil started on the PlayStation. Now, by a company called Capcom. Now, Capcom, for those of you that play video games, you know Capcom is a very big third-party developer. Now, for those of you that don't know too much about Capcom, I'll tell you a little bit about it. I'm not going to give you the whole history of it, but Capcom is responsible for creating, or at least making, the Street Fighter series. Now, you may not play video games, you may have played video games years ago and dropped off, but I guarantee you probably heard of the Street Fighter franchise. Capcom is the publisher of Street Fighter. They're also the publisher of Mega Man, the famous Mega Man series, and so many other great series that has come out for the original Nintendo all the way up to the modern day consoles of the Xbox One, the Nintendo Switch, and the PS4. So that's where Resident Evil, that's who publishes Resident Evil. Now, Resident Evil came out in North America, and I think in Japan too, in 1996, the March of 1996. And originally, Resident Evil was, when the development of the game first began, it was supposed to be a remake. The idea for this game was going to be a remake of a survival horror game. I think some might even argue the very first survival horror game. A survival horror game known as Sweet Home. Sweet Home came out in Japan only in 1989 for the Famicom. Now, Famicom is the Nintendo. Nintendo is called Famicom in Japan. Sweet Home basically had a lot of the tenets that Resident Evil would later become known for. The genre of survival horror. Now, I'm going to make another video soon about other survival horror or psychological horror games that came out for systems, but I just wanted to dedicate this one to Resident Evil for time purposes and so forth. But anyway, the gist of Sweet Home, and it was also made into a movie that I think came out alongside the game. But Sweet Home, the gist of the movie plot and the game plot, they were both the same, was about, I think, a film crew. It's in Japan that goes to this old mansion that is supposedly haunted. Haunted by a woman who lost her child some years earlier. Her child fell into an incinerator and died. And she could never get over the loss. So she would lure or abduct, I don't remember which, or both, neighborhood or children around the area, bring them to the house and murder them. And apparently, she passed away, and her supposed spirit haunts the mansion. So this film crew decided to film a documentary about the home. I forget what the name of the home was. It had a name and all that stuff. And as the film crew gets in there, bad things start happening. One of them gets possessed. They encounter all sorts of creatures and all that other stuff. But that's the gist of the plot. But with the game, you have to rely on limited resources, limited health resources, and other sort of items to get past certain obstacles. Basically, survival. It's not a genre where you're fully loaded with, like with weapons and bullets like Halo and Gears of War, where you just go in and blast your way out of horrible situations. Sometimes you have to form a strategy. Sometimes you need to search out certain items and keys to get into certain rooms, to create certain potions, to do all these sorts of things. That is the very heart of survival horror, and that is what Sweet Home was about. Now, like I was saying, Resident Evil started out as a remake of Sweet Home, but then they decided just to make a completely new game. But they took a lot of the same characteristics of Sweet Home, the mansion, survival horror aspects like creating herbal remedies, and you have limited amount of supplies, limited amount of bullets and guns and all these other things. So that's how Resident Evil came to be. And it came out here in the States in March. I'm not sure if it came out any earlier in Japan. Maybe it did. I don't know. Japan usually got these games several months before we got them here in the States, and before and much before in the PAL regions as well. But here I showed this in the other video, Resident Evil. Now this is not the first release. Some PlayStation games, much like the Saturn games, came in a long box. I don't have any PlayStation long boxes on hand, but a long box, I'll just grab this. Something like this. You see, this is for the Sega CD. This is a long box. And initially, when the PlayStation first came out, I believe up until the first 6 months, year, came out in September 1995, and up until maybe June 1996, or the summer of 1996, they switched to smaller jewel cases. So the first Resident Evil came out in March, so it was released in a long box. I still have yet to get that one. It's a little more collectible than this, but as a Resident Evil fan, I gotta have it. But getting back to my first experience with the game, I gave you a little bit of a history of it, was in, I believe, February 1997 is when I first played it. I was over at my friend Chris's house. He's the one that introduced me to a lot of other games, RPGs and so forth. His cousin came over one night with Resident Evil, and it was the long box version. And he said, I remember it very vividly, it was like around maybe 9 o'clock at night, and we all used to hang out, and he brought over Resident Evil. We heard so many things about Resident Evil. We're like, what is this? It's like a horror game. Well, bring it over. He brought it over, and he says, no. You gotta play this with the lights off. And we're like, okay. So he pops the game in, and as the narration begins, you start to feel like this is a very different game. This is a very different game than Mega Man. And it's by Capcom, that's why I'm saying it, because Capcom, usually release these very anime-looking games, like Street Fighter, the Alpha series just came out. It looked like Japanese animation. That was the very style of it. And same thing with Mega Man, very cartoonish, cutesy looking characters, and here comes Resident Evil in 3D. It has a very serious tone. It seemed very unlike Capcom. Capcom released DuckTales and Chip 'n Dale's Rescue Rangers and all those other Disney games that came out for the Nintendo that are considered classics today, and so many other games that I'm forgetting to mention. Oops, I almost made a big mistake with that one. What was the other one? Some of the Marvel games like X-Men Mutant Apocalypse, and later the X-Men vs. Street Fighter, all those things. So you get an idea of the aesthetic behind Capcom, but here you have this survival horror game with these gruesome graphics. It just seems so unlike Capcom. So we were captive, we were like really interested about that. But the narration of it, talking about partially eaten corpses, I was like, wow, this is like Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead sort of thing. And it was. It was, and lowering the lights at that time really added to the mood of it. Now, I know it's a little different today. You play the game today, I think we're we're more calloused to some of these things. We're desensitized to a lot of the things that we found so appealing, so frightening in the first Resident Evil, because we've been exposed to it over and over and over again in video games and in movies. So it wears off, but at the time it was a very unique experience. Now, also, the Resident Evil came out. I talked about full motion videos. It had full motion videos. That was back when it was the thing. But at that time when Resident Evil came out in 1996, full motion videos were on their way out. But it was one of the last games that had full motion videos. The full motion videos really, they were interesting. They were poorly acted. They were cheesy, but it added to the experience, added to the charm of Resident Evil. A couple other things about the first Resident Evil, my first experience with it that night, because we played it a little while, and we remember the one scene that had us all jump was after the intro, after you get into the mansion. For those of you that are familiar with this, you'll know what I'm talking about. When you take over your character, you could choose either two characters. Jill happened to be the best one because she could select most. Was able to hold more items than the other character, Chris. You go into this one room. It seems to be a long hallway, and you have windows. It was a pre-rendered graphics game where it's in 3D, but the backgrounds are pre-rendered, which means they're in one spot. They don't move. So you're walking, and you see Jill or Chris's back, and you're moving toward the end of the hallway where you have to make a left. Then all of a sudden, boom, the zombie dogs break through the windows. And that really had us jumping because that made us jump because we did not expect that. And then later in the game, when you return to that hallway after the dogs are gone, once again it's empty, but you hear a thumping sound, and you're like, "What the hell's that?" And then you hear it like more thumping, and then all of a sudden from behind, or sometimes in front of you, a gigantic tarantula drops down and raises its two legs and then comes after you. You're like, holy shit, we got to get out of here. But it had a lot of those moments, and that is why Resident Evil, the first one, is really, really important, and I think important to a lot of gamers. I'm going to go over a couple more things with Resident Evil. Some of the games that are in my collection. Now, I don't have every Resident Evil game. There are plenty of them, like the Revelation series and so forth. And some that I just didn't, I forgot to take off the wall. But, yeah. Later that year, Resident Evil Director's Cut came out. It was basically just, they re-released Resident Evil again. And this time, it came with the Resident Evil 2 demo. Resident Evil 2 came out in January 1998, and I made sure I got it day one, and I was not disappointed. I thought that this game was a better game than Resident Evil 1. The scares were not as scary as Resident Evil 1, although it did have its moments when you encountered the lickers and so forth. But I thought it was a better game than Resident Evil 1, but not as creepy. And then they released the last one in the main series that came out in 1999 was Resident Evil 3. Another good game, but definitely not as scary. Here's another Resident Evil game that came out. This was I inherited this from my brother-in-law. Resident Evil Gun Survivor. It's almost like Resident Evil, but in a Doom sort of format, where you see, first-person shooter like a Halo, like Doom, like Call of Duty. It wasn't that good. But moving on, I also had the GameCube. Now, the GameCube came out in 2001, and it was a competitor for the PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox. At that time in 2001, the PlayStation 2 was out for a full year and was pretty much decimating everything in its path. Not long after, the GameCube came out. Dreamcast, which was the last Sega console, gave up and put their hands up, raised the white flag, and said, Sega, at least, is not going to be making consoles anymore, which disappointed a lot of fans. They had released a Resident Evil game called Code Veronica. I apologize, I didn't grab it off the wall. It's one of the games that I forget I have, because Dreamcast sometimes is forgotten, and I forgot about it. But it was a very solid game. But getting back to the Dreamcast, the unique thing about that, getting back to the GameCube, they had an exclusive deal with Capcom where they would release some games, Resident Evil games, before they would come out for PlayStation 2. One game that did not come out for PlayStation 2, but I think was released on the PlayStation 4 network. Resident Evil 0. Now, this took place right before the events of Resident Evil, with some of the characters from that game. Pretty cool. Resident Evil. This was a complete re-imaging of the first Resident Evil. The graphics were so much better. The controls were so much better. The thing about Resident Evil that a lot of people remember was the tank controls. Now, what that basically means is when you're controlling the character, you push backwards to move forwards, and the character moved like a tank. When the character had to change its focus, either from right to left, you see the character slowly turn this way or slowly turn that way. It was a little frustrating. So for a lot of gamers that are used to more fluid controls of the games today, going back to play the original Resident Evil might be cumbersome, might be a bit of a challenge. But this one right here, I believe, got rid of the tank controls and made the character move more fluidly. And then for the GameCube, they released Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 in its original form again, just to have them on the GameCube. Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3, and they also released Code Veronica, which again I don't own that copy for the GameCube. But what really made Resident Evil popular for the GameCube, and it later came out for PlayStation 2, I think later in the year, was this release here, Resident Evil 4. Now, this is where Resident Evil takes a little bit of a turn. We talked earlier in the video about survival horror, right? And it is still survival horror, but this is where the series started going, you know, guns blazing. That was the path it was going. And although it was well received, I think it would later turn off a lot of gamers to Resident Evil. I think after the release of, now that I'm going into Xbox 360, after Resident Evil 5, although a very, very good game, I think gamers were starting to feel like Capcom was moving away from what made Resident Evil good. The horror aspect, because to be quite frankly, Resident Evil 4 and 5 were not scary. It was just a bunch of people that had a virus that were coming after you. It wasn't really, you didn't have any of those tense moments that really made you jump or made you scream. And there was, although ammunition sometimes could be scarce, you pretty much had the ammunition you needed to get through any situation. And it was more evident with Resident Evil 6, which I think was one of the worst received Resident Evil games of the main series. And they later released other games like Resident Evil Revelations, where they tried to get back to that formula of survival horror and all that stuff, and it did fairly well. But I think a lot of fans at this point, after Resident Evil 6, were a little disillusioned with the franchise and felt that, you know, it's never going to reclaim the former glory that it had of the earlier Resident Evils, until this release, Resident Evil. This is really Resident Evil 7, but it's called Resident Evil Biohazard. Now, why is it called Biohazard? Well, in Japan, as I've stated, you know, the Famicom is the Nintendo here. We have Nintendo. It's called Famicom there. Resident Evil is actually called Biohazard in Japan. I don't think it's called Biohazard in Europe. I think it's still called Resident Evil. But yeah, the series Resident Evil is known as Biohazard in Japan. But anyway, with Resident Evil 7, they try to bring it back to what made Resident Evil good. Limited amount of resources and trying to scare you rather than giving you all these sorts of weapons for you to blast through enemies left and right. It was really, really good. A lot of emphasis on puzzle solving. Not too difficult. It wasn't too difficult with the puzzles, and I don't like puzzles, to be quite frank. But some of the puzzles that, you know, made Resident Evil popular, like moving statues over certain plates on the floor to open doors, finding keys, building weapons to make them more powerful, or finding emblems to put on doors so that it could open, stuff like that. That's usually a lot of fun. I was pleasantly surprised with Resident Evil 7. My friend Pat got this for me for my birthday last year, and I was like, I'll get to it. I heard good things about it, but I'll get to it. And then when I got to it, I was like, I couldn't put it down. I can't recommend Resident Evil Biohazard or Resident Evil 7 more. That's my little appreciation video for Resident Evil. I know it went a little long. We're approaching 20 minutes, so I apologize for going so long. It's hard to talk about the entire series in 10 minutes and try to express the amount of joy that I have, the love for this series, in 10 minutes. Oh yeah, I like Resident Evil. Here's number 1, here's 2, here's 3, and so forth. It's hard to do that. So I just hope for those of you that stuck with me, I really appreciate it. And maybe you're big Resident Evil fans too. I would think that you are if you stuck with me. I'm going to be making another horror, survival horror, psychological horror video soon that will talk about games like Silent Hill and BioShock and all that other stuff later. But thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see and talk with you soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.